We're extremely excited and honored to have our distinguished guest, Perry Kulper, with us this evening. Perry is often recognized by his constructs and his visualizations that he thinks of and brings to light. Example of this can be seen in his co-authored pamphlet book with Nat Shard and his forthcoming publication with Routledge. So please check those out, as well as his Facebook page. He generously posts a lot of his work, so check that out. Additionally, Perry is one of the most influential educators of our times. He brings a collective knowledge from working at high-profile offices early in his career while experimenting on drawing as a tool to discover emergent spatial and material relationships, blending his time and influences from Los Angeles, where he served at the faculty of SCIARC for 17 years, and more recently at his time at the University of Michigan. He continually seeks to engage the cultural capacity and imagination within architecture. Additionally, I believe Perry is also working with some of our UNL grads more recently, Liz Zacko and Lindsay Von Segrin and Yunsin Hong, as well as other SCIARC alumni who are here, Chris Turner and John Treffery and Cynthia Ray, I believe, is also in the audience as well. So welcome, thank you for driving from Kansas City. Each year, Perry's studios and thesis groups and representational courses challenges students with unusual topics, forcing them to think about architecture in unconventional ways. Additionally, Perry is one of the most generous, kind, and supportive educators out there, as indicated by his recognition from Design Intelligence, 30 Most Admired Educators of 2015. And saying this, sitting on all sides of the tables from you, both as a teacher, as a colleague, and as a mentor, thank you for your contributions. In conclusion, if you've never heard Perry speak before, you're in for a real treat. So please sit back, open your minds, and be prepared to be amazed. So welcome, Perry.
Thanks, man. Thank you. I don't know who he's talking about, but I'll try to be that person. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to Kathy and to David and Olivia and the others who have made this possible. We were just talking, it was meant to, I think, we tried to come, two other friends, Brian Cantley turned up a few years ago, and Neil Spiller and I were supposed to try to get here as well, but we didn't, so I'm happy to be here today. Thank you all for coming. The part's a little bit clanky in a way. It's sort of two parts. The first part I'll read and I'll have visual support material, and there I'll focus on 5 different techniques or small scale. They're topics that allow me to make work in particular ways, and then the last half I'll go more generally through a body of projects, my own work. So if you'll bear with me, I've written some to start. It seems appropriate to introduce Caterpillar, Alice, and the Duchess. Caterpillar, who are you? This was not an encouraging opening for a conversation. Alice, I hardly know, sir, just at the present. At least I know who I was when I got up in the morning, but I think I must have changed several times since then. The Duchess, I quite agree with you, and the moral of that is, be what you would seem to be. I'm going to try to do this without stuttering 15 times. And the moral of that is, be what you would seem to be, or if you'd like it put more simply, never imagine yourself not to be otherwise than what it might appear to others that what you were or might have been was not otherwise than what you had been would have appeared to them to be otherwise. Akin to Alice's world, architects frame ideas, structure approaches, and design in all manner of means, frontally, obliquely, and on occasion from downright sideways perspectives, metaphorically occupying anamorphic points of view. In Alice's world, sorry, I've got this. In Alice's world, or in parallel to Alice's world, I'm committed to expanding the limits of architecture. Occasionally, this requires drifting behind the scenes trespassing through fissures of uncertainty, inventing tropes, hunches, and flat-out lies, constructing accomplices and alibis for the generative work of design. As such, design happens in the space of real stage or staged fright, time spent rustling through the shadows of more expected ways to work, attempting to develop a practice in search of culturally durable work. As such, design happens in the space of real staged fright, time spent rustling through the shadows of more expected ways to work, attempting to develop a practice in search of culturally durable work. This happens by snooping around, conjuring, and chipping away at diverse design methods and techniques, working towards the possibility to punch a hole through the limits of personal sensibility and predictable outcomes. Many things in my work are in play. I'm just including some images, the lead images for the lecture that I couldn't decide on, so I decided I'd show you all of them. The things that are in play for me, in addition to Alice being an important person, are these key things, and they sort of work hierarchically from top to bottom. So relational thinking or relational structuring is key to any conversation I have with myself or colleagues or students. And then conceptual breadth, drawing, and methods are things that people, if they know about me, those are things they align with me. And then the 6 sort of subsets also belong to work that I do. I'm actually going to talk about the mint green ones for a bit today. I get it at work by hook or crook. Amongst other key things, which we just looked at in the slide, I'll draw out a little bit, 5 key behind-the-scenes techniques and methods to build a discipline for design. Searching for another cultural gravity through design that crawls up the sleeves of the discipline, challenging what's expected, normalized and frequently flattened, trying to conjure work that tips its hat to contingency, to emergent potential, to an active invitation to participate. These techniques have proven useful, for me at least, in thickening the pool from which design inspiration might emanate. 1, conjuring pithy terms, language folds that work as design allies. 2, diverse design methods. 3, exercising fast twitch design muscles by working analogically. 4, tailoring visualizations. And 5, working on heterogeneous ideas in a piece of work or project. The use of these techniques augments the production of architecture for me, prompting the search for broadened cultural agency and efficacy through the agencies of design. These techniques enable productive relational entanglements in which architecture might traverse the worlds of mythology, stories, data, and familiar estrangement, while trading optimistically on its means of production, its environmental consciousness, and on emerging cultural patterns. These techniques could help navigate the seen and the unseen, the virtual and the real, breaking down binary relationships and making vulnerable known or highly predictable design outcomes. The approach might launch architecture into other places, into other scopes, indulging in staged frights all the time. These word prompts, so language is the first one I'll draw out. And I'll do these fairly quickly, the 5 points, just to try to underscore or emphasize a couple of key points about each of them. These word prompts or language folds are constructed through an imagination in search of an embroidered world through difference. They're active design agents, or perhaps ciphers on the hunt for something real and not, conceptual and teeming with potential. They are characters, sometimes many of them, trying to ferret out alternative levels of reality, small fragments of possible and who knows, perhaps impossible, but necessary worlds. In these lightly finished projects, really fast ones, and I call these each a project because I'll never get to them, but they're still projects. I've used language to stimulate spatial potential. Imagine verdant surfaces, spatial blooms, knotted thresholds, germinal objects, and fallow programs, all subject to change at the flip of a phase shift. Architecture of multiple psychologies, that is architecture that is paranoid, schizophrenic, and delusional. Architecture might possess these traits, not cause them. Using literary terms, my friend John Treffry here probably put me on to thinking about this realm. Using literary terms, aphorisms, metaphors, similes, and alliteration, analogously to conceive construction logics for architecture. What about architecture that acts like a fast change artist? Architecture might behave like the mild-mannered Clark Kent in the morning and like Superman at night. What about spatial ventriloquism, an architectural proposition speaking from one site but seemingly arriving spatially from somewhere else? What if you were to build the plan there and the section, let's say, over there, and developing software that could embroider metaphorical twists, computational mutants, historical references, and psychological whims spatially without batting an eye. Conjuring language prompts keeps my spatial imagination alive, imagining what-ifs through the creative use of words to speculate on what might be spatially possible. The second point has to do with design methods. I want to make 3 primary points about design methods to underscore this. We were just talking about this. I was saying that I think design methods are one of the most undertaught and by far most important aspects of architectural education. For me, they do 3 things. 1, the virtues of increased design versatility come from them, the production of innovative form, and the construction of disciplinary knowledge. 14 design methods identified here are framed when I work on them and work on them with students via their definition, where they come from, their preferences or biases, how authors interface with them, their indirectness to architecture or not. We develop a template for how you use them and case studies. Increasingly, a primary challenge facing the architecture design studio is the lack of understanding that a discipline for design must be established, specifically in relation to effectively implementing design methods when designing architecture. Operating in the margins of current architectural debates, the critical location of design methods and their respective affordances has been relegated to the blind spots of both the profession and the discipline, suppressed by more dominant pedagogical agendas and regimes. As educators, architects, and young architects-to-be, in my opinion, we must address this crucial aspect of spatial education if architecture is to remain vital in augmenting and constructing the cultural imagination. Given the changing nature of political, geographical, and cultural spacescapes, we might frame, position, and embrace multiple means for making work, for design, augmenting ossified and limited understandings of methods for designing. Flows of capital, global interconnectedness, technological advances are challenging static and perhaps outmoded notions of architecture. This suggests that we raise our individual and collective awareness and consciousness of diverse design methods to negotiate the surge of changes. I've identified the 14 here. They aren't correct, nor are they the only ones. They are, however, diverse in makeup, highly varied in operating potential and capacity. Their use facilitates radically different outcomes. They can be combined, translated, tailored, and even invented, turning to particular questions, tuned to particular questions at hand. I'm going to show you a series of student pieces of work that look at a handful of methods in a seminar which I teach at the University of Michigan to give you a sense of how one can work through a different method. So appropriation has to do with acquiring material that's not yours and reusing it. So it questions authenticity, authorship. It expands what one thinks is possible. So in this case, in a very small seminar, I give the students something like a high-rise surface, an aircraft carrier deck, an old quarry photograph, and ask them to work appropriatively to produce, let's say, a spatial consequence. We're not worried so much about buildability, function, code requirements being met and so on. We're just trying to expand what they think is formally and materially possible by working through appropriation. So in this case, there's a ceiling, we worked on ceilings of churches in Rome. So everything you see aside from the kind of central or background material is all simply appropriated material and reconfigured. All of these simply find material and use it to produce other alternative effects, both with respect to what the students think is possible, but also in terms of opening up conceptual and, let's say, design strategies. Again, those are very, very short pieces of work. We do a number of them during the term. Here the students were asked to make a diptych house, and they were asked to site it in the desert. I give them no more brief. I mean, I build out the brief quite extensively in terms of what its structuring capacities are, why we're working on things in relationship to other things and so on, but I just ask them to work on a diptychal house. So these are strategies, single images in which the students are trying to figure out what a house might be that has two properties. So this is a house that produces alternative weather conditions and moves through the desert periodically in different phases according to seasonal change. This is a house that continually buries and unburies itself. And this is a house that learns from surrealist thinking and basically cobbles together desert debris towards a possible domestic environment, and so forth and so on. This is a plan for a house that listens to things that are inaudible in the desert, in the spacescapes of information and data. Syntactical means has to do with producing rules, essentially, working towards kind of grammatical development in, let's say, spatial terms, normally formal with respect to architectural development. Peter Eisenman is probably the poster child in the last 50 years of syntactical development, although J. and L. Durand in the 1790s was the one who probably put using multiple parts through rules together to produce new building types on the table. So in this case, I asked the students to use, there was an XYZ coordinate system for the site. They had to deal with 6 1/3 alphabetic forms, and it had to be pink and yellow. And they worked on developing a series of rules. I don't tell them what softwares to use. I actually don't put almost any limits on them. And I'm just interested to see how they can incorporate the program that I just articulated to you, XYZ, 6 1/3, and pink and yellow, towards affordances by working through a particular method. I'm not really interested in whether this work is meaningful or significant or culturally durable. I'm again interested in them understanding the discipline for working in this case in a single method and producing work that has possible spatial ramifications. We also work on gestural translation. That has to do with a gestural structure that then is translated. So imagine that you're in a room, your favorite Michael Jackson is blaring on the headphones or the speakers, and there are 8 video cameras capturing everyone in the room dancing voraciously. You then download those video clips, you mathematize them and geometricize them as a possible formation, an architectural formation. So these pieces of work then have to do with generating some sort of gestural structure, and they had to cite these pieces of work in one of 3 places, a section by Ledoux, Lequeux, or Boulay, and that has its own interest in the framing of the work of the seminar. So again, I'm just trying to expose you to the different ways, a handful of different ways when you're working in a single method that one can produce work. It's not all encompassing work. This is very, very limited in terms of what we're trying to get the students to engage. This is a series of 12 plates, in fact, of different buildings that are modulated through gestural translation or transaction. Digital form finding, which is linked in this case to, let's say, parametric modeling. I basically asked the students to make a collection of objects for a surface. And it's up to them then to figure out what the discipline, scope, narratives, fictions, accounts are that they will bring to the table to work on the work. So again, these are very, very short pieces of work. They're not studio pieces of work. They're very, very quick, but they get the students implicated in making choices discretionarily and operationally with respect to what they're working on and how they're working, which is an anathema to most of them. It's not something that they've been frontally exposed to in their educational courses. I'll make a jump now to my work where we talk about analogous thinking. Let me go back, sorry. Derived from the Greek analogia or analogia, this design method operates through likenesses. That is, this looks like that, that operates like that, or this might be materialized like that. Analogous thinking can be a proactive ally for the architect, brokering deals with objects, events, and phenomena out of one's own design grasp or comfort, increasing the pool from which spatial and representational potential might emanate. Analogous thinking can break down categorical and disciplinary boundaries or silos, opening formal, material, and operational or behavioral range for design opportunities. It is a colloquial design method, that is, it's at hand and easily articulated. When we arrived at that city, it was like, remember when we were in Vienna, when we left the train station, it was like that. We use likenesses, we use analogs quite a lot in daily discourse, so it's an easily accessed way to work. I would argue also that, I've said this on many occasions, that it will increase your design capacities 100-fold in the snap of a fingers by just understanding analogic thinking. Maybe I get paid for that if I could do that somewhere, some places. Parenthetically, it's a design method that requires translation because you're just in the world of likenesses. This is like that, this behaves like that, this is not that. So I'll work through just a little bit, a couple of images of a project of mine, which is called the Fast Twitch House. And I was using analogs as a way to work quickly. I was using analogs as a way to generate a project fairly quickly. So the objects of the house are actually, they're organized like a tea setting. The garden surfaces are a bit like a situation room crossed with hieroglyphic utterances. And you can see, I'll develop this project a little more when I get to the work proper. And there are two sleeping vessels inside of the, let's say, bedroom that operate like the cuckoo clock. And you see these two vessels in a preliminary sketch here and here that move up and down inside of the sleeping vessel. Tailoring visualizations. When working, I raise specific questions about when and how to make design decisions. Some project interests matter now, some matter later, perhaps some matter now and later, or not at all. As a result, I tailor the representational techniques and design methods to work more effectively to shape an appropriate fit between what's being worked on and when it's being worked on. I use conventional drawings for sure, but frequently develop other kinds of drawings that are task-specific. Some of those drawing types are more abstract, some more figurative, and still others employ multiple languages of representation simultaneously. Amongst some of the drawing techniques that I've developed, and I'm sure not that I've developed, but that I use, are things like thematic drawings like this one that visually establish the topics and sometimes the scope for a piece of work, a cosmology of ideas, frequently unscaled and non-hierarchical. Or strategic plots that visually plot things, events, conceptions, and behaviors over and through time, often comprised of words, diagrams, notations, and indexes. Or aspectival drawings that establish the figurative traits or attributes of architecture without the synthetic resolution of continuity or, let's say, perspective synthesis. Or cryptic drawings that visually articulate the genetic or chromosomal makeup of a project. I develop each of these drawing types in order to work effectively on various ideas in different phases of a piece of work. Equally, I use drawings to discover what a piece of work might discuss, as much as proving what I know that it should discuss. Heterogeneous ideas. I frequently support multiple families of ideas in a piece of work. Here, the architectural drawing remains important, facilitating relationships across different forms of knowledge and amongst heterogeneous ideas. I explore relations through different languages of representation in some of my drawings, linked to any range of considerations, including discipline-specific questions, relations to phenomenon and conceptual logics, internal and external to the work, indeterminate conditions, and pragmatic considerations. I activate these relations by developing figurative and non-figurative drawing elements, including the use of words, indexes, notations, diagrams, and appropriated and drawn imagery, suggested and promiscuous in their aggregative potential. The proposal for David's Island, for example, attempts productive engagement with a range of considerations, ideas that I didn't know how to handle in my small brain. Some of the initial issues that guided the work include the islanders' experience of remoteness and isolation, the cultural import of drift, migration, and transience, the propagation of maritime mythologies and folklore, the manifestations of successive insurgencies and divergent occupations, the latent potential for constructed inundations, the real and imagined sensing of suppressive panoramic and panoptic regimes, the representational practices and influences of nautical cartography, the prospective elusiveness of nocturnal ephemera, and the literal and strategic deployment of military jargon. So those are the kinds of ideas or interests. They're interests, they're not yet ideas. Arguably, activating a broad range of ideas might increase audience breadth, enabling multiple kinds of experiences that sustain the life or scope of architecture over extended periods of time. Augmenting homogeneous thinking by engaging multiple families of ideas in a project, which I would say is unusual in architectural discourse or development, might allow relations to pasts, presents, and futures of situations, perhaps facilitating actionable disciplinary questions and robust engagement with key cultural circumstances and provocations of our time and beyond. So those are the 5 key points that I wanted to just draw out a little bit. I'll now show you a little bit more comprehensively a cross-section of my work. I'll show you a handful of houses that were made when I turned up to SciArc to hang around with people like Chris and John in the very late 80s, and 1990 is when these pieces of work were built or designed. So there's a series of houses that were, this was an invited competition, I think 50 architects in Germany. This is the proposal. There are 5 proposals, and this is one that I made. I had a real clients for a small house in one of Southern California's deserts, but a 1,600 square foot house. Steel floor is the most interesting sort of part of it. It's got a sort of fallout shelter in it. And it ages and there are unusual little objects that occupy in peculiar places in the house and so on. But it's a fairly straightforward house. I made the plan. I was saying this the other day to a group of students. I drew the plan 32 times at 1/4 inch equals a foot before I got the plan I wanted. And that was interesting then to do it 32 times. What I'm interested in now is building all 32 of those plans simultaneously as a house. So anyway, I'll just run through a series of images of these houses and won't say so much about them. None of them got built. At this time, as I mentioned, I had not gone to Los Angeles to teach. I had gone there in the hopes of opening a practice, and ended up meeting Robert Mangurian at SciArc and started teaching about 3 months later on, and was there for a while. So these are the Aspectival drawings that are a second version of that graphite drawing house. Trying to evolve a way in which I could, the sort of critical drawings, sort of beginning to represent or draw only the critical aspects of the work rather than everything. And Amy was studying at Cambridge in England, and I worked on a room essentially, a house where we lived, about 12 feet wide and about 40 feet long in the interior. There's a leather floor and a double aquarium and a sort of cactus wall and a miniature version of St. Paul's Cathedral and the double aquarium and just trying to work on the context of the neighborhood, sort of heaven and hell, and the topography there, and sort of the blue-collar neighborhood and the cemetery on either side of the house and so on. There's a rubber-lined basement below this, and just images from that. So then I was into my time at SCIARC a bit, and I came up on an open competition, the David's Island competition, and without doubt the most important piece of work for me by some. It's the first time I really began to open up the architectural drawing to see what might be discussed. It was an open program, that is, that it was left to the competitors to figure out what to do. So I articulated some of the ideas just a few minutes ago that I was interested in the work. And then I went about in the drawing, try to work out and work on those kinds of ideas, and to try to envision then programmatic opportunities, spatial thinking, representational development that would allow me to harness and discuss those kinds of ideas in the work itself. I also got involved in this piece of work in language folds, where I began to use for myself language in a provocative way to produce programs. So there are things like landings for mythical sea travelers. There are labyrinths of emptiness, axes of mutiny, and so forth and so on, bird colony lines, no-fly zones. I was beginning to develop programmatic thinking that would allow me to engage and structure the key interest that I had in the work. So the drawing became a fertile ground to both try to articulate and visualize things that I was thinking about, but at the same time discovering a lot that I was not thinking about that might have potential in the work. So just a technical drawing of the architectural elements. To give you a sense of the size of things, that vessel is about 2 football fields in length. And landings for mythical sea travelers with scientific polyp labs that harvest kelp, and labyrinths of emptiness that accelerate and decelerate wind, and polished metamorphic rock garden that's keyed in. There are sensors in 15 different oceanic conditions that data is spliced into the site and allows the polishers to work. The axis of mutiny is a piece here, and so forth and so on. Another competition, I didn't submit the David's Island one because my father died, say, prematurely while I was working on it. But another competition opportunity allowed me to continue some thinking about the architectural drawing and about how to structure things, how to work urbanistically, how to take the program for a museum and begin to fold it in ways that I thought were beneficial or useful. So I developed for myself what I called a thematic drawing, or thematic drawings, in which I'm simply visualizing the key interests of the project. So it's not a strategy or a tactic, it's a way to visually think through just the base ideas for the piece of work, how the 9 Greek muses might inform a contemporary museum. What are problems of curation and visualization in contemporary society? How about the structure of collections and inventories? What can a museum speak about? And I also continued the thinking about the programmatic fold. So there are things like electronic marionettes. There's a beauty pageant for farm animals. There are tractors that square dance in the work, and so forth. So I was working with language, visual language, words to the degree that I have any understanding or control or discipline about them. There were some cryptic drawings which were made as sort of a site drawing for the primary sort of elements of the piece of work. So think of these as chromosomes rather than architectural elements. They're just a part of the work process. These drawings are always made, they're just made for me. They're never meant to be seen in public, so it's just the way that I work. And I've been afforded, like tonight, opportunities to share some of this work in public, but the work is it's simply the way I work on things. This is a section through the primary, well, let's say, architecture of the project, and there's things like a harvesting surface, there's a gold-leafed archive, the sort of pink mottled things are gallery pieces. There are 2 sets of 9 Greek Muse-inspired pieces. There are 2 nocturnal objects that only behave at night, and so forth. So this is a kind of proto-formal drawing. There are geometric and formal and material implications, but it's not an architectural setting or settings yet. Then there are other proto-formal drawings. This is a drawing for an alabaster surface that exists in the project. And there are 9 drawing instruments which etch away and make mischief with this alabaster surface. And this is a study to try to get the Greek muses installed into these drawing instruments in a proto-formal way. This is the first sketch of the museum then, museum proposal, obviously from above. So we were looking at a proto-section here a few moments ago. There are 9 urban Greek-inspired muse pieces that wander in the city. There's a global gallery, there's an archive below, and there's fescue and cattle and roses on its surface. There are cherry picker-like elements that take the public out over that surface. You can't get to it. There are 2 robotic objects that manicure 24 plant types from around the world. There's a rocaille garden that you can't get into. The administration, to remember this, the Tractor Square dance. This is a small motel and so on. So I would say this is a sketch. I wouldn't call this anything like design yet. First, sort of rhino look at it. This is probably 3 or 4 or 5 years old now, just trying to look at the primary building analogically. And then I do things like there's a project where I try to use erasure as both a representational and architectural activity. So this is a project for a house. These are just relational drawings in which I'm trying to understand and simply work on erasure, censorship, bleaching out, recoding as a way to think through some problems that will eventually surface in the production, I hope, of a house. So there are a series of marks that are systematically put in play that are emblematic of things like furniture, outlets, lighting systems, key thresholds, and so on. Excuse me. And then the drawings and marks are systematically erased, censored, and recoded. And then there are a pair of objects that are meant to, they're just notationally coded, the pink objects that are meant to inhabit the erased condition to reboot mimetically or mnemonically considerations about what's been evaporated or evacuated from the scene. So just the fast twitch house that I mentioned when working analogically, sort of produced 3 schemes and worked on one of them. So this is a plan for one of them. This is a plan for another version. And then I'll focus a little bit on the version that you've seen a couple of images for already. Each piece of work has yellow tablets, and this one has about 60 pages. Research, it was like a sketchbook, research, notes, thoughts, formal material possibilities, and so on. And those are part of the drawings, part of the thinking, visualization techniques. And then I really wanted to start this house with a simple set of ideas about ground, sky, and horizon, using working analogically. So there are a series of drawings that are made to try to work those problems into play. So, for example, the architecture is meant to be like prehistoric animals crossed with mobile homes. They're like that. So developing just a set of drawings, these are elevations and sections of the 3 primary architectural objects in the proposal. These are obviously renderings of the proposal. You eat here. This object lives inside of this sometimes. You sleep here in the 2 vessel pieces. This piece moves along a pink dust garden. This is the living space, but it's filled with logs. And you actually live in those 2 wooden baskets, and you get up to them in a stair up here. There's a chromed oblong billiard ball, and there are milled and real cactus, and there's a cast bronze biplane, and a series of milled surfaces, garden surfaces. So this is the plan, straightforward. There's a caretaker for the pink dust garden. There are a whole series of encrypted garden surfaces that are made by landscape milling machines. So there are lots of things like this in this desert. And there are 3 chrome shadows. Each of the big objects has a chrome shadow. There's a chrome shadow and a chrome shadow. And then there are, of course, the temporal shadows. And there's a labyrinth that you can't get into. That's part of the proposal. Most of my work is quite slow. So this is a quite fast piece of work, trying to generate work quickly, limited set of ideas, working analogically. You see the chrome shadows picking up, in this case, part of the storage sack that belongs to the eating realm. The interior we looked at, the sleeping space. There's a stair that ends up 3 inches wide that goes nowhere. These things move up and down. You sleep in them. This whole piece moves along the pink dust garden when no one's there. There's the cast bronze biplane, about 12 feet in its wingspan. This is the living space. The material dematerializes over 100 years, steel. There's a pile of logs left on the site. There's also a miniature version of the proposal built on the side of this architecture, and there's a mechanical hawk that belongs to that piece. I've been interested in many pieces of work in animality, bestiality, wildness. Was invited to the Prague Biennale and asked to deal with architecture as a transient phenomenon. So I dealt with bestial characteristics in the development of a strategic drawing. It's about 15 feet long for a metaspheric zoo. Metaspheric zoo is a cross between metaphor and atmospheres, and we won't go into that. But there are 6 species developed for the proposal that are locked in analogically to different animal behaviors or traits or interrelationships or speciations, cloned, extinct, unborn, and so on. And then there are 3 programmatic elements that are stable. There's a roving taxidermy, botanic surfaces, and a vessel for obsolete atmospheres. And this is a drawing that tries to visualize some of those species in a kind of strategic plotting way without any spatial, let's say, implications yet. And then I put in one time for University of Michigan as quite nice research through making grants. And I was interested in trying to work on alternative temporalities for architecture. So I used 3 distinct aspects of landscape organizations, landscape elements, and landscape biologies to try to work on an alternative temporality, phase shifting, durational capacities for architecture. So we made a whole series of visualizations of different kinds to try to explore initially the questions about landscape organization and landscape elements coming together. So these are analogic drawings. We're just trying to look at landscape elements and organizations, trying to visualize how those might start to discuss one another with respect to the larger interests of temporal disturbances or malfunctions, let's say, of temporality. More word prompts. There are fabric predators in the proposal. There are zipper blooms. These are just early studies in which we're interested in sort of graphic, material, and indexical landscape conditions coexisting. Again, I won't bore you. There are a lot of things in this, but it didn't really get anywhere in my mind. These are part of the zipper bloom development. Strategy for beginning to deploy some of these things. Some of the later drawings in which the spatiality begins to be pointed to, the landscape and architectural scene might be something like this at a sketch or preliminary level without real temporal disturbances or temporal biologies in the work. A test tube berm, and there's a sort of field of contestation and notational and real landscapes and so on. People have been very, very generous to me. I'm super humbled by the opportunities. This is one where I was asked to participate with 24 other architects and artists in the world to produce 2 pages in a book. The book's not this big, but we had 2 weeks apiece, and we would put things into play to do with documenting urbanism. And I was thinking about alchemic urbanism as a focus or thrust for these 2 pages. Sort of ongoing work of late where I'm interested in envelopes, sort of building surfaces, skins. So a series of studies which try to get inside of what might be possible. This one's learns from M.C. Escher. There are some that learn from gaming, others which learn from Roy Lichtenstein and a body of paintings that he's making and so on. So just a series of speculative drawings about what architectural surfaces might be like. Another opportunity, a friend developed an online journal called Edge Condition and asked me to make the first drawing for the first cover online. So this is one where I take my own work and essentially try to erase it through 3 different cloud types, the half-finished drawing. David generously mentioned pamphlet architecture that Nat and I were fortunate enough to win. 3 years ago we published this. That we're interested in indeterminacy and how architecture might not predict things but might enable and invite constructions of possible worlds. So we made a specific body of work which tried to think about developing a practice to work on contingent architecture. So I made a series of drawings. This was these next drawings are trying to envision some things that this spatial realm for practicing contingent architecture might be comprised of. We're doing a new work right now for a show in London at the Bartlett in the fall, and we work at, Nat teaches at the Bartlett, and we live quite a long distance away, so we do work by Skype and email exchanges and sort of shifting images back and forth to one another. Eventually for this work, we built on the knowledge that Nat had constructed with respect to his drawing instruments, and we each built a drawing instrument. This is mine in the foreground, and this is Nat's in the distant ground. This is also to do with heterogeneous ideas. So each one of us has a dome in which there's a narrative construction. Each one of us has an object that sits near the drawing that interrupts paint throw, and each one of us has a drawing. And there are a series of exchanges through paint throws and projection and through photography and through our exchanges over Skype and via email that then allow us to discuss problems of contingency and indeterminacy, not architecturally, although I quite like thinking about some of these next to Archigram, who just opened an exhibition at the University of Michigan. I sort of like thinking of this in Plug-in City as part of their work. Not that it's of a quality of Archigram, but I like thinking of this participating in that sort of realm, but that's not what these are. We're really just trying to work on a practice, how 2 people might converse about a set of subjects that we share an interest in, but we don't articulate in similar ways at all. So these are just time-lapse photographs of the paint throws, and the objects that are highly charged objects that we construct that have to do with the drawings and the narrative, domes and so on. And then another small piece of work that I'm working on relative to a Nat and Perry piece of work, and I'm working on the site of the Titanic. And I'm just starting, I've not worked on this for quite a while now, but I'm trying to autopsy that site relative to some interest that we're trying to develop. I'm not so far from finished here. So a year and a half ago, I got invited alongside 30 other architects in the world to design a birdhouse. And Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird has been quite influential for me. And so 3 former thesis students and I strategized about 13 birdhouses. And they will eventually, not those houses, but I'm going to eventually design 13 birdhouses where I will try to frame both my work and my pedagogical interest through the 13 birdhouses. Anyway, we developed a thing which we sent to Italy and went through a whole series of drawings. We were interested in how we might contaminate human and non-human relationships, how birds might assume the position of humans, how luxury, spas, resort thinking might be afforded the birds themselves. So we developed what I called the Flights of Fancy Bird Motel. And just descriptively, it's a bird landing surface with what we call a deep taxonomic bird, the yellow one. It's a garden. It's a bird rug. It's a bird feeding table. There are 3 hedges. One doubles as perch storage. There are 3 clouds, the sort of elliptical bits. The big cloud has the name. It also has a sign, the Flights of Fancy Bird Motel, and it has a windsock room. There are 2 surveillance devices for the birds. There are 5 perches, one's underneath. And then there's the deep bird that has feathers and a nest, which hang from the underside. So these are just images of the object, 3D printed, milled, lots of 3D printed pieces, auto body shop painter, carefully packaged and sent to Italy as the first iteration of the bird motel. It's a shot from below, so there's sort of there's a spiritual figure. The yellow bird is quite important as a sort of shrine, an inverted shrine for the birds. And here you see it in all of its splendor, sporting some blue feathers. And then we did a series of things where we took the bird motel for a walk. And the idea was, and we didn't get very far with it, but was to take the bird motel and situate it in highly different conditions. The next one would probably be a diorama. The next one would probably be an ice floe in the Antarctic. The next probably would be a natural history museum. So there was an idea about how this bird motel might migrate into different situations and stimulate potential or conversation in those situations. So then more recently, there's a second version. There's a floating bird motel. There are flotillas of them. And these are some early drawings of that bird motel using some of the pieces from the earlier one just as stand-ins. So there's a garden surface. There are dancing hedges, which I'll show you an early model of, that are based on bird alphabets. There's a stuffed technology garden. There's a bird rug. There's still a feeding table. Then there are now 30 windsock rooms in the hall piece. There's a bird ballroom. There are the moments of an indication of it. There's a painted ceiling dome. There are berry clouds. There's dioramic wallpaper, this sort of mint green. And then there's a retractable circus, which is here. So this is just sort of cobbling things together at the moment. And one of the guys that worked on the work works for Olson and Kundig in Seattle, and we're just the last 2 weeks just rebooting the work. These are older now, but you begin to see the dancing hedges which track, and they inscribe things relative to the painted dome ceiling below. You see an early development of the stuffed technology garden that's based on trophy rooms. People in Texas, for example, hang around with dead animals on the wall. And then the bird table. So, sorry. In relation to some of the new work with Nat, I developed very, very quickly, in about 2 or 3 hours apiece, a set of aerial diptych follies. And these are images of those follies that they both act as didactic instruments, but they also camouflage themselves as a set of sort of kind of traveling freak show. They create false histories and construct artificial truths, let's say alternate facts. So these are very, very quick drawings in which I'm trying to envision these diptychal follies that belong to the current piece of work, or might belong to the current piece of work that Nat and I are doing. They're quite fun. They're very, very early, but they're just analogic drawings. So they just appropriate things essentially to begin to construct a world. Just a couple of more groups of images. I've made about 750 landscape drawings. They were meant to be made one a day, about an hour apiece. They are 18 inches by 24 inches, 9 by 12, 2 layers of white trace, always taped the same way, and so on. I haven't made any of these in 11 years because I've been busy with other things, but they're quite interesting to me as a way to both take the pressure away from my other work, which is quite serious for me, except for the bird motels, but also let me work on landscape thinking. So in this case, I was thinking about monochromatic landscapes, which would have incredibly intense color structure in certain places. And they're made in series. Big series is 35, a small series is 4. I was thinking about red ponds. I was thinking about invisible landscapes, and so on. And I'll finish lastly with a series of Photoshop studies. I can hardly turn the computer on. You could tell when David had to come up and Olivia had to come up and tell me which button to push. So I'm just trying to figure out cut and paste operations late at night before I go to bed. So I just made a series of studies that aren't about anything in particular, but try to just get me involved in some quasi-visualization techniques which, let's say, haven't been familiar to me. So here I'm thinking about speeding landscapes as just a prompt to get things into play. Or here I'm thinking about a post-temporal scape. And again, these are sort of hour-long things. They're Mickey Mouse, I know, but they're things that allow me to sort of work on a skill or two, super low-res things, and very, very quick, but allow me to develop some thinking. So I'm also thinking recently about what I'm trying to call deep drawings. Because I don't have a lot of time, I'm trying to figure out how to make drawings which have enormous capacity, but within really limited means. A bit like haiku, where there's quite a lot structured, but not a lot said. So these drawings this drawing in particular has to do with trying to get a leg up on deep drawings, but mostly it just has to do with fiddling around with Photoshop. And I don't make judgments about them. I just make them. It's sort of fun. Use my own work. The birdhouse obviously used. The fast twitch house is used. For sort of mucking around. But I think there's something here that might be composited with 3-dimensional construct pieces, which I'm also starting to think about as a way to work. So just a couple more images, and then I'm going to read one last thing, if you'll indulge me. So I was thinking about a house. So this is a speculative house and its landscape. Just worked on very, very quickly. And the slide we started with, and just to remember, the lecture is dedicated, of course, to Alice. I'll finish with a paragraph from my dear friend Tom Burrish about me. For Kulper, Alice in Wonderland is less a child's fantasy and more a guidebook. While the process by which most designers proceed is one of continued refinement within an ever-limited field, Kulper argues for the opposite, for ideas drawn from an ever-expanding landscape of possibilities. How else would one arrive and believe in electronic marionettes, harvesting tables, and tractor square dancing, and find them all on the same page? Kulper is convinced that not doing so not only flattens a project's potential, but also diminishes who we are as people. Thank you very much. So there's something about the internalization or the specificity of language and languages that are both in the drawings, the way I use them, and so on. But then, for example, when I'm sharing them with you, sharing thoughts with you tonight, I'm describing the work in quite conventional terms as part of what I might hear from the question. So one of the reasons I do that is because I think many of the drawings are quite obscure to people, and to see them at this rapid pace, I feel like I need to let people have some sort of grounds or orientational means by which they can then grasp something about what I've said as a setup for the work relative to what they're seeing on the screen. Otherwise, I think it's like Rorschach tests, and you're simply making out of it what you can, which is a fair thing to do as well. But I think it's a fair critique, and I think, Anthony, that also occurs. I don't make the digital models, but you see the flattening of the work when I describe it to others who need to help me then make it, that all the juice, the word plays and the analogic thinking and the structured relationships through tailored visualizations and all that, the cultural consequences, much of that gets flattened because of the kind of language or languages that I use to share the work with them, and they model it and they say, well, that's depressing. So that's why I think of them as sketches, but there's a reduction. There's a series of levels of reduction, I think, that happen. Yeah, I think that's part of the difficulty with the work right now, because it gets with the cosmologies. A lot of people talk with me about my work as inverted worlds, where I'm simply in a world constructing. I mean, I'm a bit like Wallace Stevens in 13 Ways of Looking into Blackbird. When I'm making decisions, I'm literally making them from 13 different places. Film clips that I saw, things that I need to say to the discipline or to my own development, ideas that I have that have been locked in and I'm trying to project them. So there are lots of things, what I call the mechanics of engagement. It's quite complex. There's a kind of calculus of relationships. So to wind those back in themselves and to double agent those things and to develop tropes and alibis that get those things off track in a public setting, no, that's not what you're saying, would be difficult. But I like what you're saying. The methods are only, for me, they're foundational knowledge in the discipline. If I had a School of Architecture to articulate some distinctions about, without design methods and representational techniques, knowing their histories, where they come from, what they do well, and so on, I wouldn't know how to be an architect, to be honest. And I've not been taught ever. Everyone works methodologically. Multiple methods are usually in play. Never, ever have I seen that formalized in an institutional setting. Not these 14, but methods as a cultural construct, as a disciplinary set of problems. Shocking to me, actually. So, but they're not meant to be integrated. The idea is that the exposure to them, their values, ethics, operating conditions, and so on, allow you to say, I'm working on these kinds of conditions. Those three methods, or inventing a method. Again, what's the method that sort of illustrative description I think that was the name. John was in the studio at SCI-Arc in 98, 99, something like that. So it's the first and only time where methods were frontal content. And he developed a method by which you were working on sort of atmospherics, narrative, and mathematics or something simultaneously. That's totally wrong, but based on John's interests, it was useful for him at the time, at least, to develop a way that he could embed the questions, suspend those questions within the ways in which he was working. So the idea with the methods is just to know that they're available. They produce radically different kinds of work. Gestural translations different than content to form. I'm usually content to form. Ideas to stuff. Lots of methods within that and techniques. But those are available to you, and that in different situations one might need to act differently. Most good architects don't do that. Most great architects don't do that. They rehearse a set of ideas, issues, techniques formal material, attitudinal strategies and tactics. I'm not interested in that. I don't want to make other people's work. I think each situation, whether you're working in a medieval manuscript as a site, working across the street, or working in the hypotheses of a drawing, I think we need to be able to act differently. And so that the methods are really to do with that. But I like the conventionalization. I'll think about that for sure on the plane ride tomorrow night. It's hard to, in my tenure case, the dean and chair sat down with me and they said, you got to be straightforward here in terms of how you pitch this. Otherwise, you can get off track real fast. So they said basically the architectural drawing is the way to do that. The architectural drawing for me, I'm not truly interested in it. It just allows me to do stuff and discover things and to talk about things that I otherwise was not able to talk about in plans, sections, perspectives, axonometrics, and so on. I simply am not smart enough to compress what I'm thinking about into those formats. And the method stuff is part of that as well. It really has to do with versatility in the end. And that interests me. Lots of I words, issues, interests, and ideas. These are things. For me, they can come from many, many places. They don't all have to be legitimized. Okay? Any of those things that David mentioned. The question was about the differences between ideas and interests and, say, devices or techniques or means by which one encounters those things. So for me, interests are the sort of low, every project or every piece of work has interests. Everything we do has interests. That's sort of given. And what those are, where they came from, is up to designer, collaborators, and so on. Ideas for me are a little bit stiffer because they have a projective sense. So issues, interests are things that might be in play. Ideas, I have an idea about, or a set of ideas about a piece of work have kind of initiative or begin to drive. And issues, for me, when I use issues normally are culturally grounded. So then part of the discussion that we have is how do you begin to, with ideas or issues or interests or all of those things, hunches, how do you begin to develop ways to encounter those things, to either draw them out, to reject them and to transform them, to develop alternative species out of them? And part of the reason to go through the method stuff and to go through the techniques, the affordances of those things, has to do with then how to develop devices by which one can begin to structure engagement with something. So if you think of something like Cape Canaveral, there's quite a lot of infrastructure there to get a pointy thing to go into the space for a while. There's a lot of structure there, devices that enable media logics, sort of technological advance, spectacle, and so on. There's quite a lot in terms of the ideas or interests that are in play. There's quite a lot of rigging, jigging, setting up. So we try to talk about devices as sort of jiggings, the ability to stage, to draw things out, to let things make an appearance. And sometimes with most schools of architecture, my own training as well, there are certain given and ordained techniques and devices, and others aren't discussed and not ordained. So, well, again, when some of the students, whomever it happens to be, or myself, when you encounter things that don't meet those other devices, then one needs to, innovate or analogously work across other seams to get outside of your own limitations. I'm not sure if that's I'm interested in thesis in particular, saying these are the interests. This is why it's important. These are the disciplinary and theoretical claims. How do you actually work on that? For me, in teaching, how you work on something is immensely more important than actually what you work on in the 50 or 60 year lifespan of a student or an architect, let's say. Because if you don't know how to A, work on things to begin with, and B, you don't know how to work on things outside of yourself, it's hard to imagine as cultural agents with the quickness and speed by which things are changing that you can make a serious contribution if you don't have that kind of agility.
I just wondered about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought you were going to go a slightly different direction. This is about the 6th lecture in a row where someone, Cynthia didn't say this, but people have been saying to me, why don't you work in film and video? And I've been interested in hybrid. I pointed to constructs and drawn things and so on. Why don't you work in hybrid ways? I thought you were going to go to that route. So I've been thinking about that. I guess I go to my friend Neil Spiller, who talks about split geographies and split temporalities. He basically argues that technologies are affording us to splice spacescapes of here, now, then, maybe together without any difficulty at all, so that we can be talking to 1572 Venice as much as we're sitting in the room right now together. So the question about whether we'll compete, I think architects are terribly in arrears with respect to getting on top of cultural. Social media makes architecture look piker-ish, I think. And that's quite low-level technology. But my sense is that there are a number of people working in other disciplines right now where they're splicing multiple kinds of realities together that I don't think it's a virtual and real discussion any longer. I think it's about phasing in and out of those things and cloning, hybridizing even virtual and real realms. I don't know that architects, I mean, we have to liberate ourselves in some ways from ossified ways of teaching, really, to even make that possible. Because if you can't step into that realm conceptually, it's incredibly difficult to figure out how that might happen operationally. And one of the things that we try to do, or that I try to do in particular, is try to open up conceptually what's possible with the students. And so that they can begin to wonder, and what ifs, what if I began to splice genetic logics to temporal narratives from 800 years ago linked with fabrication processes now. So I'm not answering the question, I don't think, but I think I personally, and I know I sound critical of education, and I'm an educator, and I'm critical of myself in this regard. I think I think the conceptual frameworks by which we offer students and ourselves the possibility to enter into conversation with are really, really, really limited. But your question begs a think tank environment in which we can ask questions without fear of the review and not being accredited and so on, that begin to offer architecture a step into the equation that I think gaming industry, for example, is makes us, we simply borrow their techniques. You see that at a lot of schools at the moment, rather than trying to say these are possible techniques, or we're actually going to exceed technique. It's not technique anymore, it's some blending of 3D printing and virtual realms and data logics relative to levels of embodiment that we can occupy. Thank you all very much for coming.